This is Privacy on the Ground, where privacy meets real life. In a 2020 issue of Current Opinion in Genetics and Development, Dr. Krystal Tsosie and co-authors wrote that collection of genomic information from Indigenous peoples and their ancestors may not have offered much benefit to the Indigenous groups who contributed DNA, and many have instead perpetuated stereotypes and other harms. The following year, in the American Journal of Bioethics, Dr. Tsosie and colleagues continued the critique with an article titled, "We Have Gifted Enough Indigenous Genomic Data Sovereignty in Precision Medicine."
I wrote those pieces as honestly like a last-ditch Hail Mary, that if the field was going to remove me from becoming a scientist, that I was going to leave swinging and ensure that my word had meaning. And I'm just so grateful that I've been able to be sustained in the field and doing the work that I have, because now I get to create a space for up-and-coming Indigenous students and mentees. And that is a blessing that I don't take for granted.
Dr. Krystal Tsosie is doing groundbreaking work in the field of Indigenous genomic data, Indigenous data sovereignty, and bioethics, not only from a scientific research and technology standpoint, but when it comes to advocating for meaningful representation and inclusion of Indigenous peoples to ensure their interests are protected. To her, that means making space for Indigenous peoples to lead the work that is fundamentally about Indigenous peoples in order to ensure that research and the data collection that goes along with it actually benefits the people it's intended to benefit. My name is Kate Kay. I'm Deputy Director of World Privacy Forum. This is the first episode in a series from World Privacy Forum exploring Indigenous data topics through talks with Indigenous people who are guiding pathways toward putting sometimes theoretical Indigenous data principles and concepts into practice. World Privacy Forum's Indigenous Data series is a preview of our upcoming podcast, Privacy on the Ground. Keep an ear out for it. I had the chance to sit down with Dr. Tsosie in April of 2024 in her lab, the Tsosie Lab for Indigenous Genomic Equity and Justice at Arizona State University in Tempe. Inside Dr. Tsosie's lab and in her office, weavings adorn the walls. They were woven by her paternal grandmother in Loop, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation. One of those weavings is perched on the wall above another intricate pattern, an expanded model of the double-stranded helix constructed from red, blue, black, and white marble-like balls. Yep, as Dr. Tsosie tells me, it's just like the one featured on the TV sitcom The Big Bang Theory. Those weavings are vivid reminders of the people she aims to help through her work as a genetic scientist. But the history of scientific research involving Indigenous peoples is fraught. Extractive and colonialized research practices persist today and have created deep-seated distrust of scientific researchers among Indigenous peoples. So, how and why did an Indigenous woman like Dr. Tsosie choose this field? In our talk that day at her lab, she shared how her personal interests, family, and cultural background influenced her path toward a successful educational and professional career in genetic epidemiology and bioethics. Dr. Tsosie talked about how those family and cultural foundations still inform her work today. including when it comes to advocating for Indigenous-centered research consent models, to pushing back on problematic norms in precision medicine research and data use, and in her work to bring fruition to what she calls an underdog story, the creation of the Native Biodata Consortium. When we began our talk, I asked Dr. Tsosie to introduce herself and list her titles and professional affiliations. Not surprisingly, it's quite a long and impressive list.
I am Dr. Krystal Tsosie, an Indigenous geneticist, particularly a genetic epidemiologist and bioethicist. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University in the School of Life Sciences in the Center for Biology and Society. I am also affiliate faculty with the School of Human Evolution and Social Change, associate director for the Biodiversity Knowledge Integration Center, and co-founder of the Native Biodata Consortium.
Dr. Tsosie told me about her lab at Arizona State University in Tempe, the Tsosie Lab for Indigenous Genomic Equity and Justice, and what happens there.
It's a dry lab and a wet lab. The dry lab side is focused on computational approaches to genetics and genomics as it relates to human health and health disparities in urban Indigenous communities, and also a lot of policy and ethical questions related to data governance. The wet lab side is actually a combination of genomic DNA extraction from samples that we are going to collect from participants in the future, as well as some emerging work in organoids and three-dimensional tissue culture techniques as it relates to neurogenomics. Because there's a lot of interesting things. There are a lot of interesting things that people are doing related to like what they call an indigenous reference genome or gene variants that are meant to be informative about indigenous peoples. But a lot of these assumptions are rooted in biological essentialism, and conflates a lot of notions related to indigeneity, indigenous identity, and biology, and that are not exactly meaningful in sort of the same ways that people think they are. Not everything is biologically mediated, but there's a concept that people like to believe that many things are predetermined by biological factors, including what is heritable across DNA. And for some things, like whether you are or are not indigenous, is not exactly rooted in DNA and the ways that people think they are. So, of course, there are, for instance, types of DNA testing that you can do across families, and like paternity testing to determine your direct biological lineage to a parent. But that's different than genetic ancestry testing, where people think that they can spit into a saliva kit, smell it off, and be told that they are X percentage Native American. Like, these are sociopolitical terms and constructs that have complex roots related to blood quantum rules and eugenic population descriptors as defined by U.S. law that was meant to disenfranchise Indigenous peoples of their land rights. But that is starting to become conflated and has been conflated in the minds of the public and sometimes even, unfortunately, legislators in terms of like the science. Data sovereignty is something as a term known by non-Indigenous scholars is a relatively recent term. Indigenous peoples have acknowledged that we have sovereign right to our data, our lands, our natural resources, since effectively time immemorial. But the actual scholarship behind that term is fairly recent, within the last few years. And I have had a career that existed before then.
Dr. Tsosie shared how her early personal interests, her family and upbringing, and her cultural influences, both on Navajo Nation land in Shanto, Arizona, and in Phoenix, helped inform the trajectory of her educational and career paths. Her approach to genomics and Indigenous health data sovereignty, and her understanding of the unique and complex needs of urban Indigenous and displaced Indigenous peoples, including when it comes to consent in relation to scientific research.
Yeah, so I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. To the extent that this is relevant, I am 4/4 Navajo, full-blooded. Unpack that how you will. But the important thing here is that my family has been Navajo for many, many generations. Since our peoples landed in, at least in my case, in Arizona, although the Navajo Nation, of course, also spans into Utah and New Mexico. Our family is on the Arizona side. So my mom is from Shanto, which is fairly rural. And I spent a lot of time up there as a kid. No running water, no electricity, and that's still the same way that we have lived for a really long time. My dad's side is from Loop, Arizona, which is in the southern part of the Navajo Nation, and the next closest major city is Flagstaff, Arizona. And my dad, as I mentioned earlier, he didn't go to college for reasons that a lot of people in his generation just either couldn't afford it or had barriers to access to college. Incredibly intelligent man, one of the smartest individuals I've ever had the honor of being associated with. And he's my dad. The way I said that was so formal. But he worked, he was a power plant operator. So he worked all around the state of Arizona. And eventually he worked as a power plant operator for the Phoenix Indian Medical Center. And PIMC is the largest Indian Health Service facility in the U.S., servicing American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so we moved to Phoenix, and that's where I grew up, in the western part of Phoenix. And I wasn't rich by any means. Our family wasn't rich by any means, but we were incredibly lucky to have what we did. And at some points, there are 5, sometimes 6 of us in a 2-bedroom apartment, and it was a really happy childhood. But growing up, there was murmurs of Indigenous kids stating, I grew up off res, I'm not Navajo enough. The term apple, thankfully nobody told me that, but it was kind of implied, red on the outside, white on the inside. It was also challenging because I got sequestered into honors and gifted classes and then international baccalaureate. So it's really, really fortunate that teachers helped my parents in making those decisions, but it also further isolated me from other Indigenous students. And when I started at Arizona State University as an undergrad, ASU has the largest concentration of Native American students, and it's one of the largest public institutions in the world. And yet the number of Native American students in the life sciences is pretty small, unfortunately, especially when I was up and coming. So there's a lot actually here in terms of having lived experience as an urban Native meant, and sometimes unfortunately still continues to mean, that urban Indigenous peoples are often ignored in conversations related to Indigenous data sovereignty. And I understand it's great to have these conversations grounded in the community and having tribal nations create within their purviews and within their jurisdictions laws and resolutions and policies to protect their people that reside on the lands. But the simple fact of the matter is that due to decades or well over a century plus of forced assimilation and termination policies, and now more recently economic displacement, in that most of the jobs are off reservation because all of our natural resources have been ripped away from us. Now over 80% of American Indians and Alaska Natives reside in urban suburban areas. So as much as we want to talk about the importance of community-based participatory research all we want, and those are important, when scientists understand that more indigenous peoples reside off tribal lands than on, it's a lot easier for them to just recruit indigenous peoples that live in cities and not even seek permission from tribal nations. And not even tell urban indigenous peoples that they should be cognizant of these other dynamics, especially when they're undertaking studies that reify indigenous identity as a racial ethnic category as rooted in genetic ancestry, and not even providing more culturally grounded models for consent. It's still the same broad consent model of, here's a form that you don't understand, sign on the bottom line, and now you're giving us data, the permission to use your data to study anything we want, and maybe even commodify it too, as opposed to dynamic consent, collectives consent, group consent, that are more consistent with these like non quote unquote Western approaches related to concepts of autonomy. And so that's where I am finding finally traction to really state we also need to have equal attention to indigenous peoples that have been displaced, and also for indigenous migrant individuals that come from outside of the U.S., whose data and DNA are being collected at the borders, and regulated, and also indigenous peoples residing within the context of the U.S. without formal recognition, a sovereign recognition, like for instance, when Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. I started actually, like many indigenous students in STEM fields, wanting to become a doctor because I'm first generation. I'm the first indigenous person in my family to get a PhD in especially sciences, but also the first one in my family to graduate college and the only one to hold a college degree at this point. And growing up, my parents, who were either part of the boarding school era or other forms of federal policies of displacement, they basically told myself and my siblings, like, just go to college, get a degree. And we were also told to obtain our degrees and come back to our communities and be of use to our peoples. But especially in that time, the four paths that we were expected to pursue were related to becoming a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a teacher. Scientist wasn't one of those things. Like, being a scientist and also an anthropologist and a researcher was always rooted in this history of extractive practices of data and of our lands and our languages and cultures. And certainly, especially in the biomedical health space, the extraction of our people's livelihoods, and the taking of our cell lines, and also, unfortunately, for women who had unconsented hysterectomies during the 1970s, during the Nixon family planning era, during this era of governmental forced eugenic policies, our future generations were taken away from us time and time again. So science and scientists, or becoming one, wasn't really a path that was that we were pushed down. But as a young child, I was really interested in disease and also the root causes of disease, and why are some people more susceptible to disease, etc. And I also was I also had a little bit of a morbid curiosity toward things that killed us really quickly, like viruses. I kid you not, in my as a teenager, I could tell you everything about Ebola and all the major epidemics and all the statistics and the histories related to the field. And I wanted to actually become a virologist and epidemiologist, but later found out two things when working in a lab setting. One, pretty clumsy on my feet. which is probably not a good thing if you're carrying a plate of cells infected with viruses that could kill you with no cure. And also I had not the greatest immune system. So those two things pretty much killed my career as an Ebola researcher. But it did spur my interest enough to become and pursue a bachelor's degree in microbiology and biochemistry. And I was really also interested in becoming a doctor. And at the intersection is becoming an MD PhD. So in the midst of studying for the MCAT to become a research physician, I just increasingly found research to be a lot more interesting. I was really fortunate to be in community with other mentors, especially at the Mayo Clinic Scottsdale, and then later the Biodesign Institute at ASU. And I was involved in a cancer project with first an echocardiologist at Mayo, and then that research translated to a synthetic chemist who created cancer analogs and cancer derivatives, sort of in like the drug creation space. And together as a team, we and other researchers actually patented a tumor-targeted device that would both visualize sites of early metastasis in vivo and also deliver chemotherapeutic drugs at like much lower than the drug toxicity level. And so with a few papers, a couple patents, and fresh out of undergrad, the world was my oyster. I chose one of the world's top ranked biomedical research institutions that was touted to be really great at health disparities research, and geographically is situated in a historically Black neighborhood because the founder believed that world-class research should also be accessible to people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. I thought this was a great place for me to study. And I got there and I was stymied by the amount of privilege and the amount of hubris related to biomedical research. Anyone listening who can find my CV or listen to me talk in other public settings within 1 degree of freedom will find out the name if they're so inclined. So I was at this institution, and the way that physicians spoke about being in this crime-ridden neighborhood was just because it resembled like where I grew up in West Phoenix. I thought I was in home and in community with the people that I thought we were supposed to be in relations with. And hearing physicians talk about minoritized peoples in research as objects and of research and study, and just thinking about not even engagement, just thinking about recruitment of Black and brown individuals in research to bolster their own careers was just eye-opening. And then I just learned, especially in the cancer biology space, that there's so much money involved. There's so much money in terms of pharmaceutical companies looking for the next blockbuster drug or cure. And a lot of it is patent driven. And many cancer biologists, I kid you not, will have ego measuring contests about who has more drug patents on their walls. And a question that I had as an Indigenous student was like, what am I doing in this space? If I were lucky enough that something that I contributed a lifetime of my research career towards investigating, if it even translated to through all the phases of clinical trials and made it to market, would my people even be able to afford it? Because my family back home, I know you're not supposed to, but they sometimes split antibiotics and store drugs because it's easier to self-medicate or medicate each other than it is to get an appointment several months down the road, and then being able to access just tier 1 drugs is a challenge. Nonetheless, whatever the next innovative experimental therapeutic or regimen is. And I just felt like, as somebody who didn't have a lot of Indigenous mentors and didn't have a lot of Indigenous colleagues in the space, and somebody that struggled like comparatively with my peers to get through college and through graduate school, it just didn't feel like a great use of my time. I didn't really feel that draw that it would be a benefit to my community. So I left, and then I came back to Arizona State University, attended to pivot to a career in law. So that's one of the 4 routes, right? If a doctor didn't work out for me, I was going to pursue law. And at the intersection of law and sciences is bioethics. So I enrolled in the Master's of Bioethics program. And I also learned that Arizona State University and also University of Arizona, being 2 of the 3 state-funded universities as part of the Arizona Board of Regents, were also mired at that point in the after effects of a seminal landmark lawsuit of the Havasupai tribe suing the Arizona Board of Regents, relating to misconduct of employees and researchers who collected blood samples from a remote tribal community that resides at the base of the Grand Canyon, promising them that they would study type 2 diabetes, engendering a trust partnership to undertake that research, and then ended up taking those samples and publishing other things and conducting other work related to schizophrenia, which especially then had a mental, like a social stigma attached. And then also exploring population migration narratives that were against their own cultural beliefs, and other types of research. And it was something that was emerging at the turn of the century, the case. And it was also coming at this point where many global Indigenous communities were grappling with the question of whether or not this is going to be a benefit to Indigenous peoples, or if it was going to be a new form of data piracy and biocolonialism on their people's cell lines and their people's genomic data. And since then, many global Indigenous peoples have not engaged in genomics research. The percentage of Indigenous peoples participating in genomics research is still less than 1%, like less than 1% of research participants in genomics and genetic studies are self-identified as Indigenous, right? That's really small. And this is after now 20 plus years past the completion of the human genome, the completion of the first draft of the human genome, and also just 2 decades plus of undertaking conversations of increasing diversity of underrepresented peoples in research. And that number still remains stagnant. And that tells you something about the sustained amount of distrust and mistrust of Indigenous peoples onto the space, and also researchers, and also the value of sourcing, particularly what's called rare variants from Indigenous peoples, to find undiscovered gene variants that are associated with disease. And part of this is like the bottom line of pharmaceutical companies. Anyway, to go back to my story, so I'm at this transition point of pursuing a bioethics master's, which I completed, and I realized that as extractive as I thought cancer biology was, this newer emerging field related to genetic epidemiology, and just computational approaches to genetics, moving out of the lab and onto a computer terminal and into a space of data servers and work in the cloud and clustered systems. This was going to take over the trajectory of research in this, and it was time to have Indigenous peoples actually act as scientists and also advocates to ensure that communities, if they're going to engage in the space, their interests are going to be protected. So I went back for round 2 of applying for a PhD, and I was really dead set on finding a university that ticked a bunch of boxes related to training and location, and of course having mentorship in the health disparities and genomics research spaces. And that I landed at Vanderbilt University, which I enjoyed because the institution has a world-class a project that links leftover clinical samples, like DNA collected from clinical spaces, with longitudinal electronic health records, because the system has one of the largest, or if not one of the largest, or the largest hospital systems in the state of Tennessee. So it's a rich resource for doing genome-wide association studies, for instance. And I loved my training. However, Tennessee has a fractured history as it relates to Indigenous peoples. And a previous president, President Andrew Jackson, basically forcibly removed Indigenous peoples further west. And so doing community engaged work with Indigenous peoples, unfortunately, was not going to happen in Tennessee. So I also had other challenges with mentorship, which is a whole other conversation, of finding a mentor that understood that it was important for an Indigenous person to not only be a scientist, but also to be an advocate, and that also understood that some of the assumptions related to genetics and genetic ancestry and race, especially as it relates to Native Americans, are kind of flawed. And that's hard. That's a hard critique for somebody who studied in the space, who advances that type of research, to hear that from a mentee and a younger person, right? But it was clear that talking about the importance of engagement in genetics and genomics at that time wasn't going to get the amount of traction that I needed, especially from somebody that was a pre-PhD status. So I butt heads a little bit with some of the people in the program that just didn't understand what to do with me fundamentally. And thankfully, I had other mentors at Vanderbilt University that understood what I was wanting to do. So, and also understood that if I was going to complete my PhD, I shouldn't have to go somewhere and redo all my course credits all over again that is successfully completed. So I just ended up switching my dissertation. But there's this year or so where I was actually working in industry, trying to figure out how to complete funding for the rest of my dissertation work. So I worked with Amazon first, and then Evicor, which is the nation's largest healthcare management organization, which at the time merged with the nation's largest pharmaceutical management organization, Express Scripts. And, these are both situations where big industrial or big corporate partners are doing new things with consumers' data and patients' data that I just had never seen, actually, as an academic working in a university with these clearly codified rules. And I think this is so important because academics operate in this space of, I lovingly say, naivete, because they assume, because universities operate within these federal rules rooted in the common rule, and because they receive grant funding for this work, that other entities do. So we have a lot of academics that really push hard for open data rules, forgetting also that universities benefit and have since the 1970 Bayh-Dole Act. Universities can also claim intellectual property and patenting and copyrights from research that's federally funded. But also industry is totally engaging in these research practices unchecked. And not only are they benefiting from open data sources, but they can also harmonize across those data sources, across their privatized data that nobody else can access. And they've been long engaged in machine learning spaces and artificial intelligence space with our sensitive health and genomic data for a while. I mean, some companies, not insurance companies with the genomic data, although I have stories on that one. forthcoming publication.
The computational processing of sensitive health data adds new layers of complexity and new risks to Indigenous data. In her mission to help protect it and establish community-led approaches to scientific research consent that center the rights of Indigenous people, Dr. Tsosie helped found the Native Biodata Consortium. But getting the consortium off the ground wasn't easy. In fact, the plan had its detractors.
I was able to finally work with communities in the Dakotas, advancing some work related to informed consent and community approaches to informed consent. But then also I and other Indigenous friends and colleagues and scientists, we started the Native Biodata Consortium, which is an Indigenous-led research nonprofit and a biological and data repository operating for tribal nations. And that alone is a huge story, but it's also an underdog story. Like my friend and colleague, Joseph Irichetta, we started this as graduate students. And when governmental officials and even, unfortunately, other Indigenous scholars didn't think that this would be successful, we understood that we need more community grounded approaches that centers the data rights of Indigenous peoples on tribal lands and within the hands of tribal people doing this type of work. And we're so grateful that since then, and it hasn't really been that long, we now have, I've lost count how many employees and consultants that we have. And we really built up this great nonprofit company on tribal lands, introduced high throughput sequencing on a rural tribal community to our knowledge, the first time, created a CLIA certified tribal testing facility for COVID-19, and have really started thinking about expanding into public health and public health genomics and public health spaces as well in service to the communities that we work with, and advancing the types of research questions that community members are interested in, not non-Indigenous researchers who have no idea what it's like to live within our communities. So I started in the precision medicine and precision genomics space, where it's this idealized notion that we can sequence an individual's genome and then assess what they might be potentially at risk for, and maybe even tailor some their therapies for them. And I'll come back to that in a second. But being one of the few now PhD trained Indigenous scientists and bioethicists, and has also put me in conversation to paleogenomicists in the ancient DNA space that are doing things with our ancestors and doing studies with our contemporary descendants. And because ancestral Homo sapiens are not considered humans in biomedical research because they can't consent, then they're not governed. That type of research is not governed by IRBs. But then that means that there's less barriers to accessing Indigenous people's DNA. And there's also in that space a lot of, frankly, creepy notions of pre-modern, pre-industrial Indigenous peoples that still reside amongst us today. There's like this weird sort of frontier science of discovering something about human migrations, but that just needs more DNA collected from Indigenous peoples. And then also we see this too in the biodiversity space, in terms of, like, for instance, big agriculture through the Green Revolution has really created these big monocultural crops that are now susceptible to pests and other types of immune functional failures. And the solution, of course, is Well, we have CRISPR now, and we have a lot of samples from Indigenous peoples that have been stored in biocollections and museums and archival spaces. Let's just reintroduce biodiversity back into our space and commodify it. And that's not considered data theft. And you see these narratives over and over and over again, which as Indigenous peoples have long stewarded genetically associated knowledges, and also Indigenous peoples themselves are considered like these new fonts for discovery, and that the next advances are going to be in our peoples and our lands. So let's just help ourselves to Indigenous peoples' data. So that's like the spaces, those are the spaces I'm in now. And I've been able to navigate because I don't just work in one discipline area. And I'm able to see trends across all of these different spaces and be able to be informed by all of these. And that makes sense when you think about how, I mean, data itself is not going to say, oh, I'm a data set that has special considerations with the privacy. I can't be shared. Like nobody's going to say that. The data set's not going to say that, right? What I'm also talking about is a lot of the federal and international policies relating to pushes really to open data are a bunch of researchers and scientists and people writing the rules of their own engagement. Like writing the rules of what defines fairness and equity and justice for their access to data, but not even calling to question whether or not this is a benefit to the communities that provided that data to begin with. So this is where the precision genomics space is useful, because there's an off-stated narrative. Like you open up really any journal article that starts talking about the need for more, including more diverse and underrepresented peoples in genomics. And it states over and over again, we need more data from underrepresented peoples in order to ensure that the medicine benefits them. And I'm just like, nah, I lived through this. You're going to create the technology based off our data, then you're going to commodify it, then it's going to be so expensive that our people can't afford it, and you're going to patent it from based off of our data, and then also claim your own rights to it. And our people are still never even get preventative health. Like there's a narrative of victim blaming and coercion here when researchers tell communities that they are going to miss out on the benefits of precision medicine if they do not engage. But then at the same time, not changing the power imbalances that created those inequities to begin with. It's like Lucy constantly lifting up the football from poor Charlie Brown, right? And like we don't call enough to the narratives of other Indigenous communities. For instance, the 5 Indigenous peoples in Mexico and Central and South America that gave up their data almost forcibly or without proper full consent of researchers that helicoptered in. These are called vampire projects, like the early large-scale diversity projects, where researchers came in, into communities, promised them that therapies and treatments that would cure the ailments that were afflicting them, and then left. And then the next thing we know, we have these cell lines from Indigenous peoples being commodified and traded, and data sets that are made publicly available to benefit scientists' careers and their grants, and tons of money is maybe not directly exchanged, but a lot of money is being made off of it. 23andMe and Ancestry, for instance, their estimates of percent Native American ancestry come from those 5 Indigenous groups. And meanwhile, those communities are still waiting. They're still waiting for those initial promises that scientists made to be to come to fruition. And what are we doing as researchers? They're making the same promises to other people, and nobody is calling to ensure that we're not overpromising on something that we can't deliver. And worse yet, when I talk to researchers while I was being trained, I asked, like, what are you doing to ensure that your research benefits the communities that you work with? And researchers looked at me as if I was insane. And they're like, what do you mean? we do it all the time. We publish the papers, and then it's up to somebody else to ensure that the benefits of the research impact the communities. I'm like, no, community members are not benefiting in that way, in this idealized path. It just benefits researchers' careers and their tenure points. And you can just see this over and over again, the same extractive narrative in different disciplines across different data types. And it's important for all of us to be cognizant so that we're not perpetuating these same cycles of harm and exploitation again and again. There have been a lot of attempts at trying to befit Indigenous research protocols onto an already colonial backbone, right? And like, for instance, federally funded research, there's a requirement for it to be deposited in a public database. And the one that's implied is dbGaP, database of genotypes and phenotypes. And for well over 10 years, I have been discussions of, well, how do we put Indigenous peoples in a space where they can govern, who has access to this data? And you're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, and trying to befit this colonial system is not going to work if the system is flawed to begin with. So what we started was this fundamental beginning, this revitalization of, we can do it better, and we can do it from the ground up. If it just starts with repatriating or rematriating data back into the communities, then what does that look like? How do we create servers that are rooted in these dynamic consent models that perhaps utilize upcoming approaches as rooted in machine learning and AI for more sophisticated consent processes, and as rooted in blockchaining and federated approaches, and even encryption models. Like, we don't have to default back to those same days of open data and everyone has access to everything and has to download everything onto their local machines. We've advanced and we have other industries to look towards, like banking industries, for instance, to cite Dr. Kaylee Fox, who came up with that wonderful analogous series of structures. Like, banks can do it, and they do it quicker with greater amounts of data than geneticists do. We can utilize the same approaches in the genomic space, and to really think about how to protect Indigenous peoples, and also operating within tribal law, and also as a nonprofit, ensuring that the community benefits first and not last, ensuring that rather than entrusting researchers to do the right thing once they get the hands on our data, like flipping around that dynamic. And now researchers have to approach us and communities and show that they are going to do their research in good faith, and under the governance of tribal research review boards. And so that was the model that we started with Native Biodata Consortium.
Traditional models of consent and traditional approaches used by IRBs, or institutional review boards, simply were not designed to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples. But Dr. Tsosie has embarked on another project that could help establish more suitable approaches: the RADx Tribal Data Repository. The repository is funded through a $9 million National Institutes of Health grant for Native scientists at Arizona State University and other institutions, including the Native Biodata Consortium. And Dr. Tsosie is one of the co-principal investigators in ASU's scope of work related to community engagement and work facilitating tribal data sharing protocols for the RADx Tribal Data Repository.
With the RADx Tribal Data Repository, it's a way of the NIH now understanding that we need a tribally run model to govern and house tribal data from federally funded biomedical research. And so that's really interesting to be in a situation where just 5 years ago, like justice-centered approaches towards genomics research and collection didn't really exist. And now we have Congress understanding that this is important. Like if we are going to talk about equity and innovation, then this also means ensuring that communities have a greater agency in the data decisions about them. This is not meant to house biological data or biomedical data, so no genomic data. The call is for common data elements, and beyond the period of this award period, our task is to create a data repository that operates and is answerable to Indigenous data sovereignties and policy and governance, and lay that framework. As for what Congress through the NIH Common Fund wants to do from that point on, or whether or not we're part of it, or who takes it over, or who manages it, we cannot say anything about that because I'm not Congress. I wish I were sometimes, and sometimes I wish I weren't. But those are statements I cannot make. But one way that I say this is, like, we want to create a house and the foundation, and we want to make it welcoming. And if tribes want to utilize it, great. If not, there's a model for perhaps how a different tribal nation can create and utilize their sovereignty to create their own data solutions that work for them.
Dr. Tsosie and others working to inspire policymakers in scientific research and regulatory arenas to adopt Indigenous data sovereignty approaches have made some inroads. But shifting long, entrenched practices remains a major challenge. Whether it's designing appropriate and rigorous methods for assessing qualitative research or acknowledging the need for Indigenous scientists to advocate for Indigenous research and data rights.
I'm on a number of national, to include some federal and international policy groups related to some well-known organizations that are thankfully paying more attention to Indigenous data sovereignties and how to incorporate this within some of the data management, data policies that they're putting forward. And I'm really grateful to that. Some of the pushback that I get from even well-meaning individuals is just that inability to have a paradigm shift, and also this lack of acknowledgement that ethics means also employing a different set of tools and methods that also need to be considered along with the technologies. Like, just as important as it is to keep track of, the shift from short read sequencing to long read sequencing, and who does that better with, better calls, right, and call rates. It's also important to understand, how are we assessing these feedback, these perspectives from communities? And that's also a set of rigorous sets of methods and approach as related in qualitative research, and really being respectful of that. So there's one, the fields are shifting, and being kept abreast of how norms of ethics are being conversed about in these spaces is so important. It's part of keeping up to date. But then also, it's so important to acknowledge your positionality in this space too. Like, if somebody has something to gain expressively from gaining access to, a supposedly new or novel data set, like, it is important to understand, oh, wait, that might be a conflict in my writing a rule or a protocol or a paper about guidelines in the field if all I'm doing is aiding my own access to that data set, if I'm not thinking about the larger implications of this work. And also some also require some self-reflection. is the work actually benefiting the people that we say it's benefiting? And if not, then we need to pivot. And there's quite a bit of hubris involved in not acknowledging and having that self-reflection. And those are the types of power dynamics that I see. And also, engagement is not recruitment. Many people will use the term interchangeably, that or state that engagement is a means to getting more access to data, and that's coercion there. And there's really something to be said about the importance of bidirectional relationships, and also acknowledging that research partnerships don't just end when the paper is published. You know, I was a graduate student for a really long time. Not because I wanted to be, but because there were people in the field that didn't understand what I was trying to do as an Indigenous person and as a scientist up and coming. Like, you could not be a few years ago a scientist and an advocate. Like, for instance, a top biomedical journal blocked Indigenous scientists from providing commentary about a large-scale diversity project that was recruiting Indigenous peoples. And they said that we could not write our own commentary because we were, as members of the community, they said that we could not be unobjective. I'm like, what is objectivity? And so they started asking non-Indigenous peoples to write a paper about issues that we were more knowledge about. And so there's that subjectivity question that's often used to disentangle us from our actually lived experiences and our expertise. And that is something that I had to engage in. And academia is colonial. Like, some of the smartest individuals I know who work in the same space with direct communities don't have their PhD yet. And I just got my PhD like not even 2 years ago. And I am repeatedly, it feels like stamped out by people that think that because they've had a PhD for a few years more than me, that they know better. And they act as roadblocks. And I am glad and I'm so grateful to the people that have read my work, who cite my work, and who understand the importance of the work, because I wrote those pieces as honestly like a last-ditch Hail Mary, that if the field was going to remove me from becoming a scientist, that I was going to leave swinging and ensure that my word had meaning. And I'm just so grateful that I've been able to be sustained in the field and doing the work that I have, because now I get to create a space for up and coming Indigenous students and mentees. And that is a blessing that I don't take for granted. When I couldn't find enough local traction, like, I'm so grateful to the people, my mentors, that actually graduated me with my PhD at Vanderbilt, because they really believed in me, and they fought the administration to keep me as a student. But in terms of building those networks, it was external mentors who are now my friends. And those people are the same people I get to work with. So Dr. Matthew Anderson, soon to be Dr. Joseph Irasheta, Dr. Kealu Fox, like those are the individuals that keep me going. And then there are, of course, journal editors like Nature Genetics. Had a great set of editors, still do, but I have a couple in mind a few years ago, and just other people that understood that we need to have Indigenous peoples lead the work that's fundamentally about Indigenous peoples. So hopefully I get to pay it forward with the next generation of Indigenous data science leaders.
I'd like to thank Dr. Krystal Tsosie for her immense generosity in sharing her time and her personal story with us in a way that truly illuminates what Indigenous data sovereignty is really about and why it matters. My name is Kate Kay. Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about World Privacy Forum and our work in data privacy in relation to healthcare, biometrics and identity, AI, and more, please visit worldprivacyforum.org.